Hello and welcome to the first Sunderland AFC preview show of the season. We are going to look ahead to the game against Oxford this weekend, and I am joined by the Sunderland Echoes, Phil Smith, and the Chronicle's James Hunter. I suppose the first place to start is pre-season. Phil, you were over in Portugal and saw all the action that happened there, so what was the mood like in the camp there? 0-0 draw against Benfica B and 1-0 defeat against Belenenses.
Yeah, pretty good. I think it was a good standard of opposition. That's the first thing. It's always a difficult balance in pre-season. Do you play teams that you know you're going to get a big win against, or do you test yourselves? And they went for the latter, and very different opposition to what you'll face in League One. Teams that like to play out from the back, teams that like to keep the ball on the floor, which you won't necessarily see at some of the away games we go to this season. But certainly physically in that heat and against that calibre of opposition, it was a really, really good workout. And I think it was, although the results weren't great, I thought the performances were pretty good, bedding into a new system. And generally speaking, I think it's nice to have a little bit of continuity. I think there's quite a settled feel about the place. The players came back, and for the first time in a lot of seasons, you had most of the squad still together. So hopefully it's a kind of an evolution that'll lead to a good start of the season.
And Herenveen, obviously here last weekend, lost 1-0, but again, I think Sunderland played reasonably well in that game. James, what did you make of that match?
Yeah, well, it's the traditional dress rehearsal prior to the start of the season, so it's a game against the toughest opposition that Sunderland have faced in pre-season. They're a Dutch top flight team, so they're a good side, and Sunderland performed pretty well. There was just obviously the one goal, which was an absolute worldie from Fike, the midfielder. You couldn't really put much between the sides aside from that. In fact, if anything, Sunderland had the better chances and hit the woodwork a couple of times. So, I thought it was a good dress rehearsal for the season. There were lots of positives. Obviously, the result wasn't right, but as Phil said, the results in pre-season are not really the thing. It's the performances and the cohesion around the squad really, and the team that matters.
You mentioned we hit the post. That was Elliot Embleton who took that free kick. I don't know if it took him maybe a nick on the way in, but he's a player that has impressed me quite a bit so far in pre-season. But what have you made of him so far?
Yeah, I think he's a really exciting talent. He has a lot of things that you don't often see from a player of that age in terms of his maturity on the ball. His vision is absolutely fantastic, and we saw particularly in the Portugal games that Duncan Watmore was loving playing in front of him, because he was finding him with those little runs off the defender every time, and you could tell Duncan was enjoying that. And there's a lot to like about him. The fact he's genuinely two-footed is not something you see very often at all. That makes him very hard to defend against. So it's been really exciting. I think he's going to get a big opportunity, and now it's about producing consistently. But it's a great sign of how the loan system should work, because he'll know now he can compete against men, because he did it last year in League Two. He knows he can play his football but also do the physical side of it as well. So it's a really, really exciting time for him, and I don't think there's any doubt this first couple of months he's going to get a big opportunity, and it's just up to him now to take it but he seems like someone who'll embrace that pressure. He seems to back himself, not in an arrogant way, just generally has a confidence about him. I think he believes in his ability, and hopefully we'll see that, because that's what you want at the same right. You want players who work hard, but you want a bit of swagger. Fans here have always liked players who play with a bit of a strut and a bit of a swagger, and hopefully Elliot can bring that this season.
Yeah, I've seen loads of him play for the under-23s as well. Seen him come through from the youth ranks, and he's always been a player that the coaching staff here at Sunderland have had marked out as somebody with the potential to make that transition to first team, and he proved last season at Grimsby out on loan that he could do it. He's versatile. He can play in a number of different roles. He's quite creative. I think in this system that Jack Ross played throughout most of pre-season, this sort of 4-3-2-1, if you like, he's kind of tailor-made to play in one of the two roles, if you like, just off a central striker, Will Grigg perhaps, or when fit, Charlie Wyke, just to give a little bit of creative input down the channels, and I thought he looked really good in that role when he played against Herenveen.
You mentioned formations there. I think Jack Ross has taken it a different way this season, isn't he? He seems to have went to three at the back. Do you think that's something he's going to stick with this season, or do you think could see the 4-2-3-1 that we played last year?
He's played three at the back in every game, so that tells you that's, I think, how they're going to start, because if you bring in new players and bed them into that system, it's a sure giveaway that's how you're going to start the season, I think. But what I will also say is that when we spoke to Jack at the start of pre-season, one of the things he said was that he felt other teams had last year that Sunderland didn't, was flexibility. So the ability to be really comfortable going to a back four within a game, or putting another striker on I think because of the turnover that the squad had in the summer and because of the fact that the players weren't familiar, I think they struggled a little bit to just switch systems in games. I think it threw them off a little bit, whereas some of the other teams were able to rotate really easily. So I think that I'd be stunned if they didn't start with that system because, like I say, it would be a big departure from doing it all the way through pre-season. But there's definitely many times in games where you go to a back four, where you put two central strikers in. And I think a big thing for Jack in this pre-season, and hopefully that continuity will make it an easy process, as he wanted to have those options to make little alterations to the system in games and not for it to suddenly throw the balance of the side out and for players to suddenly look a little bit lost. I think that's one of the big things he identified that maybe rivals at the top of the table had last year that they maybe didn't, and I think bedding this new system in pre-season has been a big part of moving towards that.
Yeah, and I think that you can see from the players that have arrived as well that they're versatile players that can play in more than one different role. You know, people like Jordan Willis that's come in, he can play at right back or he can play in central defence, and Connor McLaughlin as another one. So there's more flexibility there, as Phil said, to move system during games and also to tailor the system depending on the opposition you're facing. Like Phil, I expect Jack will start with 3 centre-backs on Saturday, just because it seems a crazy thing to do, or an unusual thing to do, to go all the way through pre-season with one system and then to suddenly change on the opening day of the season. It just wouldn't make sense. So I would expect Sunderland at least to start out that way. But it's a fluid situation now, and if they needed to change midway through the game on Saturday, they could do that. I mean, if you look back to the opening day of last season against Charlton, there was a change of system at half-time in that game. Sunderland went to a back three. So even right back then, Jack Ross was showing the the willingness to make that change if he felt it suits. And now I think he's got the players who are better suited to doing that.
I want to talk now about some of the new signings. We've seen an influx of Coventry players. Essentially, that's marked our business so far. But I want to start with Jordan Willis. I think, to me, he was I don't want to say standout player, but he was the one on there that sort of, you could see that Sunderland needed a player like him. And what do you make of that signing and his performances so far throughout pre-season?
Well, first of all, he's looked very good. He's got something that Sunderland didn't necessarily have a huge amount of in the back line last season. That's pace, which makes a big difference. Because if you've got that pace in your defenders in terms of their recovery, it allows you to be a little bit more expansive in the way you play. Because if you feel like you can't expose your defence, then you've got to set up the team in a certain way. And I think most of Sunderland's defenders last year, to be fair, they all had spells where they did really well. But the balance clearly wasn't quite right, because Jack had to keep changing it. And I think the pace Jordan brings will make a really big difference. And it was a big coup for the club to get him, because there was the opportunity for him to go into the Championship. Sunderland did really well to convince him that this was the best place for him to grow. And in that sense, it's a really, really exciting addition. And it's nice that continuity we've had from last season has allowed the club to be really targeted in knowing exactly what kind of player they want and having a head start and going out and trying to get them rather than chasing their tail, which for all sorts of reasons has often been the case in the past. So hopefully he kind of sums up where Sunderland are at now in terms of that continuity and being able to improve gradually in a really targeted way.
Lee Burge, presumably brought in as a cover goalkeeper, but we've got a player there who's played a lot of games at this level and has a proven track record. So to give that competition to John, I think that's imperative.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be amazed if John McLaughlin doesn't start as the first choice at the weekend and start the season that way. But Lee Burge has shown in his performances in pre-season that he's perfectly capable of stepping in as and when, and you certainly wouldn't be worried if for any reason John McLaughlin picked up an injury and missed half a dozen games. You wouldn't be worried with Lee Burge starting in the side. From what we've seen in pre-season on his performances, he's looked very solid and very capable. Obviously in previous seasons, goalkeeper has been a problem position for Sunderland in recent times until John McLaughlin came. So I think he's also been one of the standout performances along with Jordan Willis in pre-season. I
mean, the big thing about that is having that experienced League One goalkeeper as your second choice might give you the opportunity to play through international breaks if you want that option. If John does get called up to Scotland, I'm sure he will because of his ability. Obviously if you have a large part of your squad getting called up, I'm sure you'll postpone. But if you don't, you only have one or two, having such a proven deputy might give you this chance to say, okay, let's just play this game because we've got someone I can believe step in. And that might be a massive bonus for Sunderland this year, because we talked a lot about the fixture pile up towards the end of the year. And if they can avoid that, that might be something of an advantage.
Mark McNulty, another former Coventry City player, been at Reading since then, had a loan spell last season, but he's a player that will give us a bit of versatility up front because he can play down the middle but also pretty much anywhere behind the striker as well. I mean, what do you make of that addition, and do you see him being more of an impact substitute, or do you see him actually starting games?
It's a difficult one to say really, because we've seen very little of him, just that sort of 20 minutes or whatever it was here at the Stadium of Light against Heronvane. So it's difficult to say, but by all accounts he scored a few goals against Hartlepool on Monday in the behind closed doors friendly. So he certainly seems full of confidence and on form at the moment. I guess the big thing is Will Grigg and when fit Charlie White, will they fire? They haven't scored at all in pre-season, and I think Mark McNulty being there right behind them, pushing them, will give them some stiff competition. And not only that, there's also the option to play him as a second striker, and that could be a role that he thrives in. He's played there in previous times at previous clubs, so there's no reason to believe that he couldn't do that here as well.
Connor McLaughlin, Northern Ireland international, proven at this level with Fleetwood, and then went to Millwall. I think he had the suspension, and that kind of knocked him there for his spell there. What do you make of that sign? Obviously an experienced player.
Yeah, well, I mean, the best thing you can say about Connor McLaughlin is that in the pre-season games so far, you've almost not noticed him, but in a positive way, because he's just done his job without any fuss. He's won challenges, he's been really good in the air, he's really tidy on the ball, keeps it simple, but is comfortable bringing it out if needs be. And in many ways, that's almost the ultimate compliment you can pay a defender if you don't really notice that he's on the pitch, because he's just going about his business. Again, it's a theme. Mark McNulty's another we've talked all the way through. It's that little bit of versatility. You can play at full back in a back four. You can play on the right of a back three. You can play at right wing back if necessary. So again, it's just another sign of these players that are coming in, just giving that added versatility. And to me, he looks like just exactly what you need in League One. He's comfortable on the ball, which you'll need because you want to break teams down at home. But you also know if you go away from home and it's one of those tough games and tough conditions and the ball's flying around in the air, he's going to be able to stand up to it. So that just looks to me like a really, really canny addition.
George Dobson, I think he came on Saturday and seemed to add a bit of energy, didn't he? He come on and he was about the place and he looked good, comfortable on the ball. I think that's a signing, 21 years old, played over 100 games already. He seems like a player who can grow with the football club going forward. But what did you make of that business?
Yeah, I think he was a really astute signing, really. I spoke to his former manager at Walsall, John Whitney, in the week, and he was singing his praises, and he rates him very highly, and he thinks that he'll be a perfect fit here at Sunderland. I must admit, again, he's another player that we only got a brief look at last weekend. But he's capable of playing in a couple of different positions. He can play in that defensive midfield role, which he did for Walsall last season. But he's also, I know Jack Ross wants to push him forward and sees him in the role of sort of a box-to-box style midfielder too. And he's capable of doing that. As you say, he's played 100 games or so. He's also had a short spell over in Holland with Sparta Rotterdam. So he's got experience and he hasn't been afraid to make the jump into senior football from under 23 football. A lot of players are very happy in being in a comfort zone and playing in that under 23 league, but he made the decision to drop a couple of divisions to go to Walsall and get out of that, and I think that that's paid off for him, and hopefully his move here to Sunderland will do the same.
In terms of departures, Lee Catmull obviously went. That was a big one at the start of summer. But George Honeyman rumoured to be signing for Hull, but don't know if that one's went through or not. But a little bit on him. It's interesting to see that the club's been willing to let him go, especially since he was captain of the club. Quite an integral figure last year. What do you make of the news that George might be on his way from the club?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that from an emotional side of things, I'm really sad to see George go. George kind of lived everybody's dream, really, in terms of being someone who came through the academy and wanted that opportunity and got it. He was always an absolute pleasure to talk to for that reason, because you knew how much he understood the responsibility he had, you knew how much he cared, and you knew that every day you had someone at the academy lighting around the club who would demand nothing but the best from everybody because he cared so much. So whenever you lose someone like that, it's a massive loss, and you can never underestimate the off-field stuff. We all, because we see them on a Saturday, we all talk about the the games and the stuff you see on the pitch and sometimes off the pitch doesn't get enough attention, and George embodied everything that was better about Sunderland last year from where it had been. So from that sense, it's a real loss, and you can't wish him anything but the best. In terms of a football side, well, from a business point of view, he had one year left on his contract, and it's also an area where you want to progress some of the other young midfielders in the way that George got his opportunity a few years ago and progressed as a player and is now moving on. Maybe now it's time for you, George Dobson's and your Elliot Embleton, to have that opportunity. So I think there's two sides to it. From a business point of view, it makes sense, but there's no getting past the fact that it's a big loss for the football club, and hopefully he goes on and succeeds at Hull. I'm sure everyone wishes that for him.
Yeah, I mean, it is sad to see him leave. Another one that I've seen come through from the academy here at the club, and he's somebody that he was made a captain last season. He took that role incredibly seriously. He was very proud to be captain, I know, and he was somebody that never let the club down. I think in many ways he's kind of what they call a coach's player. He's the kind of player that managers and coaches really appreciate. Possibly he doesn't grab the headlines or grab the eye like some players do, like for instance an Aidan McGeady does, but he's a bit of a Swiss Army knife of a player, really. He can perform so many different functions. That he's the kind of player that a manager loves to have in his side or in his squad, somebody he can call on and be depended on in any one of a number of roles. And so it is going to be a loss to the club and a loss to Jack Ross to see him go. But the club's overstocked on central midfielders. It was clear that at least one would have to go this summer, and you can only move on the players that you've got offers for. I think probably in an ideal world it wouldn't have been George Honeyman that goes out of the door, but he's the one that there was interest in, and that's why he's on his way. But I can only wish him all the best at Hull, assuming that move goes through.
Brian Oviedo was the one who went through, I think, last week or earlier this week. I can't remember now. I think it was Monday. Was it?
Monday? Yeah,
It's all blues into one now, as you get the pre-season. But Brian Oviedo leaves. I think that was more a budgetary thing, wasn't it? He was on a lot of money, and I think it was one of them. The club, when we didn't get promoted to the Championship, just couldn't afford to keep a player like him.
Yeah, I think that Brian was very popular, I think, with most supporters. I think people liked the way he carried himself, and that humility he always had right from day one. Clearly there's a budgetary factor to it, but there's also a realism that last year Brian didn't outperform Denver Hume and he didn't outperform Reece James. Those three rotated fairly regularly, and I'm not sure anyone could say that Brian stood out above the other two. Brian had fantastic quality, as good as a left foot as you'll ever see, and we'll all remember that cross on the opening day last season for Lyndon Gooch. That was the quality he had. Yeah. Did we see it week in, week out in League One? Probably not, and you have to. So it makes perfect sense that taking all of that into account, you would say, well, hang on, let's push our youngster Denver Hume and let's give him an opportunity to shine. I'm sure that Denver will get some competition now because you can't go into the season with one left back, but I think it's one of those that just a solution had to be found, because clearly it's unsustainable to have a player like Brian on your wage books at this level, and also you could argue that you weren't getting the massive upside on the pitch that you would need to justify that. So it's just one of those sensible decisions, I think.
Yeah, it's partly financial and also partly value for money, isn't it? I mean, yes, you're paying wages that are way out of kilter with League One for Brian, but you ask yourself, could I spend a quarter of those wages but get more than 1/4 of the player? And I think that at this level you probably can. But again, he's somebody else who was great to deal with, great to speak to, a great person to have around the club. He wasn't the sort of person that would sulk following the double relegation. He gave all he could last season in and around his injuries, and another one that I guess you wish all the best.
Season ahead, final section now. I want to talk a bit about expectations. I think it's fair to say the expectation at Sunderland is that they get promoted this season, no matter how that is, playoffs or automatics. Would you agree with that? Is that the minimum?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not one of those who would say that you have to win the league or get this many points or whatever. I think if you get up, you get up, and if that's finishing 6th and fluting through the playoffs, that wouldn't bother me at all, I think. But listen, last year was always, the expectation was to go up, but there was always that understanding of the bigger picture of the club, and that it might be a slightly longer project. I think everyone would say that your second year, you want to get out of that division. I think the squad looks good, it looks well balanced, there's plenty of options. So yeah, I think promotion has to be the minimum aim. But what I would say is I don't really think it matters how you get there, as long as you get there. But they should be well set up to have a real good go at the top two in the title, I think.
Yeah, the ends justify the means. So as long as you get up one way by hook or by crook, that's what counts. I think anybody that thinks Sunderland will walk this league or will walk automatic promotion, needs to consider what happened last season and maybe think again. It's not going to be easy. Hopefully Sunderland will finish in that top two, and they certainly have a squad that's capable of doing so. But you can't take that for granted. We saw last season, we saw that Luton, who'd just come straight out of League Two, how they went about it in this league, and they surprised everybody. And so you can't take anything for granted. But I do think that Sunderland are more than capable of winning promotion this year, possibly even as one of the top two, and that's what they have to target.
Which teams do you look at as the closest challengers? I think the obvious ones: Rotherham, Ipswich, Portsmouth again. Are they the three that we're mainly worried about, or is there other teams in there that you think might put up a challenge, maybe a Coventry or a Burton?
I think so. I think Portsmouth, they've lost Jamal Lowe and Matt Clark, but they've replaced them really well. John Marquis and Marcus Harness is a fantastic signing. Anyone who was here for the game against Burton last year will know what a talent he is. So you know that they're going to be there or thereabouts, because Kenny Jackett sides always are in League One, and if anything, they've only got stronger from last year. Rotherham again will be there or thereabouts. Ipswich will be interesting because they'll be going through a similar thing that Sunderland had last year, where it's going to be a massive culture shock for them. They're going to be dealing with massive expectations from their fan base. So I think they'll be up there, but I think like Sunderland last year, I think it'll be a big period of adjustment. And then in terms of outside that, I think Coventry, if it wasn't for the fact that they weren't playing at their own stadium, I would have them as massive, massive contenders. I really rate Mark Robbins. They've signed well, they've got a great squad, but you don't know whether or not it's going to affect them playing their games at Birmingham City. It's impossible to judge. But I certainly think I'd be absolutely stunned if Portsmouth weren't one of the top two. And I think Rotherham, you look at the experience they've got at this level, you know they're going to be competitive as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can only echo what Phil said really there. For me, I think Portsmouth are going to be the biggest threat for Sunderland, and we know how to what degree Sunderland's season was tied up with Portsmouth last season in the checker trade, and then in the league, and also in the playoffs, obviously. I think you'd be quite brave to put some money on it not being the same again. It could be round two this time.
I suppose we came this far without really mentioning the opposition this weekend. So Oxford, looking at them, the signers have brought in a few players. Alex Goran's a player that Sunderland probably knows. He's an academy product here. Ben Woodburn came in from Liverpool, and he was a player linked with Sunderland a few years ago. Chris Cadden was the other notable player that I picked out there. He came from Motherwell. I think he's went to Columbus Crew in America. He's on loan there. But they don't have a striker at the moment. They've only got Jamie Mackey, who's kind of a striker, kind of a winger. What do you make of Oxford? And do you see them being as good as they were here last season when they came and got a point at the Stadium Light and played really well? Do you think it'll be an easier day for Sunderland?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think last year, from the two games we watched when we saw them play Oxford, you would never have said that they were a team that was scrambling around at the bottom of the table, because they looked excellent. Real pace in the wide areas, particularly in the second game where they had Marcus Brown, Jordan Graham on loan from Wolves, and Gavin White. Their squad looks significantly weaker at the moment. I felt the second half of last season they had a top six squad, given the loanees that they'd brought in. At the moment, on paper, they don't look anything like that at the moment. The signings they've brought in this week, it's a big ask for them to come in and shine on Saturday for someone like Ben Woodburn or anything else. So certainly on paper, they don't look like the same Oxford as last year. But having said that, when they came up here, they really went for it. They really seemed to embrace the occasion. Manager was very, very positive in his game plan, and so you wouldn't take anything for granted, because the first half an hour of that game, Sunderland were on the ropes, and they could have been 2 or 3-0 down and out of sight. So I'm sure Sunderland won't be taking them lightly, but at the moment they don't look like the side they were last year. No,
it's always a bit of a voyage into the unknown as well. At the start of the season, nobody quite knows how things will gel. I mean, Oxford's big problem last season was they got off to a terrible start and spent the rest of the season trying to make up for that. That can always be a factor. Even though they later produced good results and good form, that start always hampered them all the way through. I think they do look weaker right now than they did last season, but also I think Sunderland are better set up. They've got a better pool of players now possibly to cope with League One opposition. So I think it will be a bit of a different scenario to last season. I mean, I think Sunderland played Oxford early September last time, and don't forget that I think Max Power was sent off in that game, so they didn't play that game with a full complement of players. Hopefully this time, it'll be 11 against 11, and that, that could make a big difference.
And looking ahead, this game I think is more important for Sunderland because of the games they've got coming from that. Ipswich and Portsmouth, two teams that are definitely going to be competing with us. So do you think that's imperative that we get off to a good start so that we're set up to maybe drop points in the two that follow? Or am I putting too much pressure on the team?
Well, I just think that if you look at Luton last year, for example, started relatively slowly and generated serious momentum after that. So I don't think it's necessarily imperative. I also think certainly going away to that Ipswich game the second weekend of the season, I think Ipswich will be under a lot more pressure than Sunderland, because Sunderland will be feeling pretty settled about themselves, a lot of continuity. There'll be a lot of pressure for Ipswich at home because their fans will be expecting them to walk this division this year, and they'll be expecting them first home game to put in a big performance. Maybe that'll suit Sunderland, turning up, feeling good about themselves, knowing themselves as a team. Maybe that's actually a massive opportunity to go and claim an early scalp. So I don't think it's imperative, but you want to win your home games. Sunderland dropped too many points at home. They drew too many home games last year. So in that sense, it's important to kind of get off on the front foot. But I see that Ipswich game more as an opportunity than necessarily a kind of a hurdle that you could trip up on.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about imperatives. As I said earlier, it's the ends that justify the means. So if you lose your first two games but you win promotion, then it doesn't really matter that you lost those first two games. Obviously, from a psychological point of view, it's probably more important. A good start does set you up and keeps the mood positive. So that's what you've got to hope happens. But it's the final analysis when these things really matter. So I would say winning start in these first couple of games, yes, very desirable, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And if Sunderland end up with 3 points, 4 points, whatever it might be from these first two games, it's not a catastrophe. People need to keep things in perspective and take the long view and not just look at these two games in isolation, or even the start in isolation. Of course it helps you, but it's not time to panic if you haven't won your first two or your first three games.
Perfect. Well, thanks Phil. Thanks James for coming along. We'll be bringing these to you every week, hopefully. Obviously there's plenty of Tuesday night games that might scupper our plans, but hopefully this preview show will be coming to you every week before the games. And again, thanks for coming on, and hopefully we'll get a positive result, and next week we'll be talking about a big 3 points.